The issue was how to employ U-boats within the bounds of maritime law. Maritime law in 1914 had been codified by the Declaration of London in 1909, which was a series of agreements about how commerce warfare might be carried out in the First World War. Significantly, neither Britain nor the United States had signed the Declaration of London, but Germany had. And part of the Declaration of London said that in future conflict, economic blockades would be carried out under so-called cruiser rules. The idea of cruiser rules was that a cruiser, or indeed any other vessel intercepting a merchantman, would make that merchantman stop. They would then summon the skipper or an officer to them, who would bring documentation proving what the ship was carrying. If it was found to be carrying contraband or material that was going to be useful for an enemy to make war, then the stopping ship, the cruiser, or indeed the U-boat, could then send the crew back, tell them that they had a certain amount of time to abandon ship, and then they would sink the vessel. In the U-boat's case, almost always using their deck gun. It was more efficient, it was simpler, you saved torpedoes for the really big targets that you couldn't sink with your gun. And there's an image here, in fact, in 1915, of a U-boat doing just this. It stopped a merchantman on the right-hand side of the picture. It's pointing its gun. You can just see it. The U-boat's gun on the left-hand side is pointing the gun, just warning it there's going to be action, and it's waiting for the skipper or an officer to come across to show his cargo manifest. And if it was found to contain contraband, then the U-boat would be in its legal rights to destroy this merchant vessel. The problem with cruiser warfare was that it inevitably took away some advantages of the U-boat. It forced a U-boat to surface, it forced a U-boat to stop as well, because to carry out an inspection of the paperwork, it would be necessary to summon skippers across, or in some very rare cases, put a U-boat search party aboard a ship. And the U-boat was at its most vulnerable when it had stopped, of course. And so this posed certain risks and certain dangers. It was also felt that this took away some of the edge of the U-boats by stopping ships, by diminishing the surprise effect of being attacked from underwater, and indeed the terrorizing effect of that. The overall effectiveness of the U-boats was felt to be somewhat diminished. Nevertheless, the idea of using U-boats to attack commerce caught on in the latter part of 1914. It was informed by several factors. The first was that the British had imposed a very effective economic blockade of Germany that was cutting Germany off from world imports. Effectively, the British had closed the entrances and exits from the North Sea, across the Orkneys, to Scandinavia in the north, and across the English Channel to the south. That blockade would get tighter and tighter as the war grew on. The Germans were enraged by it and declared it a food blockade, a starvation blockade, which was illegal under the terms of the Declaration of London. Of course, Britain was not a signatory to that. Furthermore, by early 1915, the Germans were struggling strategically. They had based their entire war plan on a very short, victorious war, primarily, of course, against France in the West. And when that failed and trench warfare took over and deadlock settled in the West, they needed a new way to take the war to their enemies. Frustrated at land, angered by the British blockade, German naval planners put more and more pressure on the Kaiser to approve a so-called unrestricted campaign, where the cruiser rules would be abandoned, and instead an area around the British Isles would be declared as a war zone, and any merchant ship traversing this war zone would be liable to be attacked and sunk without warning. Of course, this in practice means being torpedoed without any opportunity to know the U-boat is even there. There will be no inspections, there will be no opportunity for you to man the lifeboats. Instead, you are at risk of being sunk if you are in the waters declared a war zone. The Kaiser himself had doubts about this, and we'll revisit these doubts as this presentation continues, but he was hustled into this in early 1915. He himself was frustrated by the course of the war. He wanted to see Germany take a more active and aggressive role, and he was pressured by naval staff who were struggling for a way to try and redress the balance at sea to turn the U-boats into action. And this led to the so-called First Unrestricted Campaign, waged between February and August 1915. Under the terms of this campaign, the waters around the British Isles were declared a war zone, and any merchant vessel traversing them was at risk of destruction. It didn't matter whether they were under Allied flags or whether they were under neutral flags. Simply being in these waters ran the risk that your ship would be intercepted and it would be destroyed. The decision to introduce unrestricted warfare in February 1915 was in hindsight, an extremely poor one for Germany. Germany only had 25 U-boats available for this campaign. Remember, the pre-war study had suggested at least 200 would be needed. Furthermore, of these 25, a number of them were being used for training, some were under repairs, and some were extraordinarily obsolete and barely able to function underwater. In reality, the Germans were attempting this campaign with perhaps 12 active U-boats on the western approaches. Perilously small numbers to carry out an all-out campaign. Furthermore, this deliberate denunciation of the Declaration of London and the threat to neutral traffic, notably traffic from the neutral United States, put Germany in a very dangerous diplomatic position. It threatened to get the worst of both worlds. It would enrage neutral opinion and possibly turn neutrals against it. And its military effects could not be vast because there simply weren't enough U-boats available to really make this work. And although more U-boats were being constructed, particularly the small UB and UC class that could be constructed quickly, it took about 4 months to build these small submarines, they wouldn't be in action until the latter part of 1915. But nevertheless, the campaign was unleashed. And even though it was unrestricted, which means U-boat skippers had permission to strike from beneath the waves without checking for contraband, in reality, most U-boats still sank their targets with their deck gun. In fact, during this campaign, about 75% of all sinkings were carried out through the gun and only about 20–25% through torpedoes. The remainder, U-boat laid mines. Remember, the UC class is a mine-laying submarine and it deliberately lay mines across known merchantman routes. The first unrestricted campaign, nevertheless, was a shocking break with legal traditions and indeed diplomatic norms. It outraged neutral opinion, not merely in the United States, but also in European neutrals, particularly the Netherlands and Scandinavia, who found their ships under attack during this period as well. But by far the most famous victim of this period was, of course, the Lusitania, sunk without warning by German torpedoes on the 7th of May, 1915 to the south of Ireland. Lusitania was one of the world's most famous ships in 1915. It was an unmistakable, vast, famed cruise liner. And the fact that it was engaged without warning was an immediate source of controversy. The death toll, of course, in the sinking was also extreme. Almost 1,200 men, women, and children perished, including 128 American citizens. Since this time, there have been almost endless conspiracy theories about whether the Lusitania was carrying ammunition, whether it had deliberately been placed into an area where U-boats were known to be operating, whether it was a trick to try and inflame American opinion, and 1,000 other conspiracies you can find online. They began almost the day after the sinking was confirmed. In reality, none of them are true. The Lusitania was carrying a small amount of ammunition relative to its vast size, but the fact of the matter was it was a passenger liner, one of the most famous in the world, and it was sunk without warning. The Germans then compounded this error by rather diplomatically treading on toes in the immediate aftermath. They didn't handle the political fallout of this very well, whereas the Allies were enraged. And it's important to remember what an outrage this was in May 1915. For almost 1,200 civilians on a passenger liner to be killed in this way by a merciless enemy who, of course, had struck from below the waves, who were then left without making any attempt to rescue those who were struggling in the sea, was extraordinarily outrageous, both in Britain, in Europe, and perhaps above all else, in the United States. And the loss of 128 American citizens' lives in this incident meant that it became a huge media and political problem in the United States.